Hello and welcome. I'm Joanne Law, and this session is about theory and skills. We're looking at advanced skills and conflict theory that helps to support the work that we do as mediators. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging leaders. I especially would like to welcome any First Australians who are here with us today or watching this recording. I come to you today from the lands of the Gunai people in Gippsland, Victoria. I'm the Director of Mediation Institute, where I train and support dispute resolution professionals. I'm also a mediator. I'm a family dispute resolution practitioner and accredited mediator under AMDRAS, and I provide my mediation services through Interact Support Incorporated. What I'd like to achieve today is help you to build your theoretical understanding and enhance your practical skills. So as you're watching this, think about what your biggest challenge is when you're learning mediation skills so far. A really common comment from students after their first role play as a mediator is, oh my goodness, I thought it was really easy, but now I'm finding it much more difficult, particularly in knowing what to ask, knowing what to say. There's always a gap between knowing and doing. So what I'd like to look at today is a couple of the key theories. There's a lot more in your course, so please take the time to go through, really think about some of the foundational understanding that we have as mediators. We'll also look at some of the skills and practices. Firstly, one of the concepts we talk about a lot is interest-based negotiation, as opposed to positional bargaining, the settlement conference style work that is often done in mediations where there's lawyers involved. So the preparation work is done to an extent by the lawyers and then brings them together to try and nut out a deal. That isn't really what you're learning as a nationally accredited mediator. You're learning a much more principled, integrative style of negotiation where the people that are involved in the dispute are negotiating directly, and a lot of that preparation is done firstly in the pre-mediation stages by the mediator and then in the actual mediation. What we're working on is to help the parties to find a solution that's acceptable to all of them. The job of the mediator is to ensure that the relative differences in power don't cause an abusive process or someone being coerced into something that isn't in their best interest. The key principles about interest-based negotiation is firstly to identify interests. So positions are what people say they want, so they're the demands, the requests, but the interests are what matters to them, why those positions have been formed, what's underlying them. So part of the role that we have as a mediator is to help the parties and yourself to understand the reasons behind people's positions. Then to help them to generate options, to develop solutions that incorporate those interests of all the parties and look for mutual benefits. So we're looking for win-win outcomes, things that are mutually acceptable, ideally that enhance relationships and create value. Sometimes there's a perception that conflict and disputes are bad things, but often what can arise from them is new understandings that can result in improvement in the situation if the work's done well. So the steps involved in interest-based negotiation. So step back, but also keep in mind the process of mediation. So the three phases, so setting up the scene and determining the agenda. So that's the mediator's opening statements, the parties' opening statements, and then from that, drawing together a neutral agenda. The understanding the issues and exploring the options, the exploration, the option generation, and the work that happens in the private sessions, and then the final phase of the mediation, the reality testing and negotiation of those potential points of agreement, and then documenting the agreement and our final closing statements. So that's the process, bringing the steps together into those 3 phases. What we're doing in order to support that interest-based negotiation is we're doing the preparation and really helping the parties to understand those underlying interests. What are the issues and why do they matter? Generating and evaluating the options, so brainstorming those possible solutions, evaluating them to find the best ones, rather than latching on to the first thing that's said, really looking at, could this work for both of them? Are they willing to do them? And then as that, in that agreement stage, negotiation and documentation, will they work for both and can they commit to them? What are the barriers? What are the countermeasures that might need to put in place? What if they don't do what they say they're going to do? What then? Okay, so keeping that in mind, what we're trying to achieve with interest-based negotiation, it's really going to guide the questions that you ask. So using a mindset and a frame of curiosity, and realizing that if you're assuming, if you're guessing, then those are opportunities to ask questions, because assumptions really are just playing out our biases and our own mental filters. We need to hear from people. Now, the next concept that I think is really, really important and a brilliant model is the Thomas-Kilmann conflict styles model. Now, please be mindful, this is not people's personalities. This is not who they are. This is how they're approaching dealing with this specific conflict situation. Where we really want to get to in mediation is ideally up into this collaboration zone, where both people are expressing their needs and wants, their assertiveness is high, and both are thinking about how they can get what they need by helping the other person to get what they need. So their cooperation is high. If you're in some of these other areas, it's going to be problematic for your mediation. Compromise, sometimes mediation is spoken about as being a process to facilitate a compromise, and certainly that settlement negotiation style of mediation is very much focused on that. One of the things that I see as a trainer of mediators is that our lawyer mediators often are very, very quick to try and push towards a compromise, because that's what they've experienced as advocates working in a mediation situation in the past. And look, sometimes that is necessary. That's the best that you can get. However, it's always good to aim for a collaborative outcome that both sides are more than satisfied with what they're able to achieve. So with the competing style, people are really not thinking about the other person. This is something that can become very common in conflict, that we become quite selfish and self-centered. We disregard other people's needs and wants. As a mediator, part of our role is to try and help people that are in that mindset to realise that it's for their own benefit as well, to consider the needs of the others. Sometimes when people are competing, they can become quite unpleasant or even abusive, so it's important that we keep the process safe, we enforce ground rules, we support active listening, so we may need to teach them and show them and require them to listen to what's being said to them. We need to help them to see the benefits for them to reach a fair agreement. So they're really focused on their own needs, and so we need to frame in terms of the benefit for them. allowing the other person to also get what they to express, to hear them, and to negotiate for their own needs. Now, avoiding is also a very, very common style that we see in mediation. It may be reluctance to even engage in mediation. People are invited, but don't feel like they have the personal power to be able to negotiate directly. They may think that they're going to get a better outcome from a determinative process. That's really the case. Things don't necessarily go to a judgment anyway. There's often quite a bit of pressure to reach a deal of some sort. People that have come to mediation but have got this avoiding approach will often be really reluctant to make decisions, and they'll try and defer things and put them off, and they won't really tell you what they want or need without additional support, and they're not really focused on encouraging the other person to get what they need. You may need to check in privately with them if they've disengaged or they won't commit, and remind them that now is actually the time where they need to make a decision, because this is the point of decision. Again, you may need to support active listening. Sometimes this can be fear-based, so we do need to be mindful of what's happened in the past and whether or not there are really reasons why they need to have additional support in the process. So again, the pre-mediation, the preparation stages of the mediation process are really important to make sure that people are in the right position or frame of mind to be able to make decisions. And again, helping them to see the benefits of engaging and sharing their interests. With an accommodating style, that can seem to be good, it makes it easy, they give in, but it's potentially not going to be supportive of a long-term agreement, or you may find that they come out of the mediation saying that they were really pressured into everything. So again, checking in, if they're giving in, why are they giving in? And you may be able to do this during your exploration and option generation by really verbalizing what you're seeing, or you may do it in private. Again, supporting active listening. It's such a powerful process of ensuring mutual understanding and helping them to see the benefits of engaging and sharing their interests. So accommodating people are focused on the relationship, they're focused on meeting the needs of others in a lot of ways, and sometimes won't be great at verbalizing their own needs. And then, as I said before, compromise might be an okay or the best outcome you can get, but it also can be a sign that you're just jumping on the first option that's raised. So if you're just starting exploration in your mediation and you're trying to lock in options, you're falling into that compromise mindset. By all means, acknowledge options that are raised, but you're really going to want to reality test those early options. So will it solve the issue? Will it work for all of them? And are they committed to it? You don't need to do that real locking in type reality testing till later in the mediation. So make a note, but often those early options are a compromise that could have been a better outcome if you had spent a little bit more time and got the parties to really think about their interests and how well that solution meet them. Okay, so that's a little intensive on conflict styles. There's a lot more content in the course. The Thomas-Kilmann Institute also have a blog and put out a lot of information. So this is really a really powerful foundational theory that can help you to see through all the noise of the way people are behaving. A couple of concepts around skills for effective, respectful communication. Here's another theory, the conflict triangle, and just this little ABC mnemonic. So A is for attitude, what and how the parties think. So that's the prejudices, the beliefs, the perceptions, the feelings, the biases that are filters to their perception. So part of what we're doing in mediation is helping to surface those and bring them to people's awareness so that they can see where there's misunderstandings that have coloured their attitude perhaps. What's visible is the behaviour, what they say and do. So the statements, the actions, the insults, the attacks. And that's why when you're doing your exploration, you do want to look a little bit of the history. You want to get an understanding of what's led up to now, what's happened in the past, what they've attempted, and what may or may not have worked. And context. Context is also important. What's going on around them, the cultural, social, political, economical, historical background to the dispute, the organisation, and so on. So that helps to perpetuate, it kind of flavours the conflict. So that's from work from Professor Joanne Law. So you can have a look at more on that as well. Now, I talked a lot about how important active listening is, and I see that it's not necessarily a skill that people coming into mediation training have, or everyone has, but it is a really crucial skill, both in using it ourselves and helping our clients to use it. So when we're talking about active listening, it's a critical skill. It involves fully concentrating, understanding, responding, and remembering what's been said. Often people feel, oh, maybe I won't remember, I need to make a lot of notes. If you're really listening, you will. It's the problem of splitting your attention, of trying to make notes. You're writing notes about something that they said before and you're not listening to what they're saying now, and then you don't hear that, and it's not helpful. Our notes in mediation should be really short, keyword type things as we're forming an agenda, and just a quick note of points of agreement or options, but verbalize them as you're making the notes so that you stop them talking and you're able to just do that without losing your attention on what other people are saying. So that maybe that's a little hint, because I hear this issue quite often, that people are worried about not being able to remember things. So if something you think is important to make a note, verbalize while you're doing the note. So do a summary. So it's you that's speaking, not you missing out on what the other person's saying. Does that make sense? Okay. So active listening goes beyond merely hearing words. It really is focused on you doing the work to understand the emotions, the perspectives behind them. Remember that ABC? What's going on that the person would be thinking that? So you're listening attentively. Remember, your notes are virtually of no value at all. Try and shut up your internal dialogues or preparing for your turn to speak, and just listen. Use your little summaries to capture and reinforce what you've heard. So you're reflecting, you're paraphrasing, you're repeating back in your own words, using reported speech always as a mediator during those phases to confirm your understanding. So that allows the speaker of the room to clarify. Do it in a way to make sure they understand you're checking in and you welcome corrections. So don't be dogmatic so that they feel like they can't correct you. Ask open-ended questions. So encourage elaboration by asking questions that can't be answered with a yes or no. Can you tell me more about how the situation made you feel, rather than saying, were you angry? Acknowledge and validate emotions, but don't mind read. So, are you, thinking, oh, they were angry. Maybe they weren't angry. Maybe they were disappointed. Maybe they were frustrated. If you're wanting to know what someone was feeling, ask them. So ask and acknowledge in general terms. You might say something like, I can see this is having an impact on you, or that seems to be upsetting. Can you tell me more about why that is, whatever, rather than guessing or assuming. And summarize key points. So do mini summaries as you go. That ensures clarity and understanding. It helps to keep the conversation on track. It reinforces engagement. And if you're really worried about forgetting, then that gives you the opportunity to reinforce for yourself, and you might make a little note when you're making those summaries. So facilitating active listening between the parties. You saw when I was talking about influencing the presenting conflict styles, how frequently getting the parties to active listen is a tool in doing that. Firstly, you need to create a safe environment. People won't, particularly people who use an avoidance style, they won't express themselves, or those that are used to accommodating, if they don't feel comfortable or safe to do so. So for them to express their thoughts and emotions, you need to establish and enforce ground rules for behaviour. I've occasionally heard mediators say, oh, it doesn't upset me if there's a, robust conversation. Yes, but what about your parties? Are you that confident that it's not upsetting at least one of them and inhibiting their ability to speak about things that really matter to them? We need to model active listening ourselves. So we demonstrate active listening techniques during the party's opening statements, and that's part of helping encourage the parties to do the same. So verbalise, check in. Don't, as I see some mediators doing, they're listening, they're making notes, but they're not actually saying anything. And so the parties don't know what you've written down, and it may or may not be accurate. And also, you don't need extensive notes. Encourage open dialogue. So ask open questions, directing back to the parties to speak directly to each other during the exploration. Often we need to jump in, active listen for them and redirect them back, either asking the person that's speaking to elaborate or asking the person who's listening to paraphrase, to make sure that they're really heard what was being said. So someone who's got a competing style, maybe starting to debate or whatever, will tend to need a little bit more help in actually listening, checking in that they've heard what was being said, particularly if they're mismatching in the way they respond. Validate feelings. So acknowledge and validate the emotions of each party to help build trust and rapport. And that redirecting back if the parties begin debating. So reframe to focus on interest, paraphrase key points without the blaming language, focus on common ground, shift the focus to another agenda item if necessary, but always do a mini summary of where they're up to before you do that. Sometimes you need to take a break, so you might decide it's a good time for a private session, even just taking a breath break. And again, maintaining neutrality, so stay impartial and avoid taking sides, really focusing on understanding all viewpoints. That's facilitating active listening. That's a lot of what you're trying to do during that exploration phase. That's something that often gets missed by novice mediators, and it may be something that's resulting in you not getting good outcomes when you're facilitating. Just a quick refresher on reframing and neutralising language. Sometimes people think, when do I do these things? A couple of the points where you might think, okay, maybe I need to help them to be able to hear the message because they can't hear it because of the blaming language. So if someone's saying, you always, you never, it's going to, in most people, cause them to feel defensive, and they may not be able to hear the underlying complaint or issue. We want to help them move from that blame frame to understanding perspectives. So we need to, because it's not attacking us, we're in a situation as a mediator, we're able to listen for that underlying issue and shift the focus so that the parties can explore that. For example, someone might say, you never listen to me. We need to explore that sense that there's a communication issue. We might say something like, it seems like there are times when you feel unheard. Now's your opportunity. So can you please tell the other party's name why this is important to you? So You see, we're shifting beyond that blaming language, and we're not going to do the absolutes. We wouldn't say, oh, it seems like the other person never listens to you. We flipped it around a little bit. That's the thing. When you're reframing, we're really changing the position someone's standing on. So we've moved it away from blaming that person, you never listen to me, to what the speaker's feeling, so you feel unheard, and reminding them that that's why you're here, you're in mediation, it's your opportunity to be heard. What do you want to be heard about? Tell them what's important, why this is important to you. Positional language is another opportunity. When someone's using very strong positional, I want full control over the project, we need to move from positions to interest. They're saying what they want, but why is that important to them? A statement like, it sounds like having a lot of control in the project's very important to you. What are your concerns if you don't have that control? So in that reframe, I've flipped them to the opposite. So what is it they're imagining will happen if they aren't in control? So that can be a good way to find out what's the negative or, you could have asked, what's the benefits of you being fully in control? I find sometimes asking what people fear might happen can be a really good way to find out what's underneath a position. Another time we might use a reframe or need to neutralize language is shifting focus from the negative. Someone might say, I don't want to work with them. What they're saying, what they're talking about is what they don't want, their negative focus, and not what they want. So we'd want to be asking them to talk about, rather than directly negating what they're saying, we want them to look at what would a good working relationship look like for you. If there was a way to work with them, what would that look like? You might directly address it, but there's various ways. But what I want you to think about is what your intention is. Your intention is to switch their thinking from the negative, what they don't want, to what they would want, getting them to articulate what would work for them. Hopefully that makes sense. What I'd encourage is you really practice listening for these sorts of language patterns from people and practice reframing and neutralising everywhere you go in your general everyday life, so that these things become second nature for you. You don't even have to think about them. Ambiguous language. This is really, really common, that people just speak vaguely. And part of our job as a mediator is to clarify that, because under ambiguous language are assumptions. We fill in the blanks and we may fill them in wrong. So someone says this example, this is unfair. So we want to get the party to specify their concerns. So we're going to ask for more details and try and positively reframe. If someone says something like that, oh, this is unfair, or you're being unfair to you as the mediator, it's human nature for us to get reactive and defensive, the same way that clients do when they hear things like that about them. So instead of that, ask for more detail and ask them, can you explain what feels unfair to you and what changes you'd like to see? Or just think, but using a tone of voice that's not defensive, that's not taking it as attack. They've said something, we're not sure what it is that they're concerned about. We need to ask for greater clarity. So that all or nothing language, the absolutes, I already had something about that on the other page, but it's such a common pattern. The you always, the you never. Again, we need to look for the underlying need underneath the accusations and the thinking pattern that the person's doing. In that, they feel like they're not responding to their emails. What are emails? We can chunk up there. It's a form of communication, so this may be a communication problem. We might say something like, it sounds like there have been times when your emails haven't been acknowledged. Can we discuss how to improve communication? Or something to that effect. So we're flipping away from the blaming, all or nothing thinking, to thinking about, okay, there's a problem with communication. How might that be resolved? And just a reminder to reframe your language. It's very common for us to use assumptive, evaluative language as people, but as a mediator, that's not what you want to do. So focusing on the parties and not yourself. So for example, if you say something like, I think that solution's fair, you're evaluating, you're giving your opinion, and you've got quite a lot of power in that room, and so what you say does influence what's going on. So it would be much better for you to put that back to the parties and ask them to evaluate. So rather than you saying, I think this solution is fair, you might do a little summary about what the solution is and ask them, how well does this solution address both of your concerns? So just use an open question, put it back to them, let them evaluate it. They're the ones that are going to have to live with it. Okay, so this is another concept about diffusing conflict. So we're talking about through micro interventions. They're the small, subtle actions and responses that we use as a mediator in the moment to help manage and reduce tension caused by either overt or microaggressions from the parties. So they're not the grand speeches, the formal breaks, they're just the light touch techniques that can help calm the room, keep it safe, reset the energy, and or redirect the focus, but without interrupting your flow or the flow of the party. So here's a little list of some of the things that you can do. You can use silence, so intentionally pause after someone makes an inflammatory comment. That gives parties the space to just reflect and reduce the back and forth if they're starting to escalate. Shifting body language. So particularly if you're in person, we can use our body language, we can use our own energy really effective to try and calm the situation down. There's a lot more on that in understanding deeply rapport and leading rapport, but it's a little bit harder online because people are often not actually looking at the screen as they're talking or whatever. But if you're doing in-person work, but you can certainly use your body. Acknowledging and reframing emotional language. We've already looked a little bit about translating blame or attack, and you might be able to translate that into feelings or interests. If someone's just said something quite aggressive, you might say, so what I'm hearing is that this situation's really impacted you. Can you share a little bit more about that? Or something like that. It gives people acknowledgement. Generally, if people's strong emotions aren't acknowledged, they will continue to escalate because they think you haven't noticed. So make sure they know you've noticed and that you've acknowledged. But we can also normalize strong emotions. Something like, it's understandable this is upsetting. These issues matter to both of you. So I've done that in an even-handed way so that I haven't singled out either one of them. But sometimes that, again, it's normal, it's okay, as long as they're not getting abusive, then that can be a way of calming things down. Redirecting focus to interests and the future. So people might start going over the past and this never worked, blah blah blah. So you might just do a little circuit breaker. So can we just pause for a moment? What's most important to you moving forward? And I'd like to hear from both of you who'd like to go first. You could physically reset. So a short break, if a private session isn't appropriate, even just things are heating up in here. Let's just take a deep breath before we go any further. You've given them a bit of time. You've just let that simmer, that boil come down off to simmer, and that sometimes can be enough. And then a light summary that might break the spiral of an argument. Briefly summarize what's been said in neutral language. I'm hearing two different perspectives on blah. Let's capture those. So Bob, you said blah, blah, blah. Bev, you said things. So it seems like there's some perspective differences there. Then you're able to restart because they've again settled a little bit. Think of your clients as pots coming to the boil. And these little micro interventions can sometimes just take the heat out. However, Sometimes that's not going to be enough and you've tried some of those. So you might need to really use something a bit more robust, and the AROC acronym might be helpful for you. So this was developed by Ken Speakman, who came up with this as a structured way to calmly and effectively handle interruptions without damaging rapport. So basically acknowledge, restate the ground rules, offer options, and get a commitment from the people. So you can read through that, but you might say something like, I understand it may be difficult listening without being able to offer your views, but you did agree not to interrupt, so please make a note of what you want to say and we can cover it later. Is that okay? So that might be someone who persists in interrupting during the party's opening statements, as an example. Okay, so you can pause and really think through that. I'd encourage you to have a comfortable statement like this that you're able to bring out if needed. The next thing I want you to have a think about is the circle of conflict causes that was developed by Christopher Moore. So this is a method of evaluating conflict that can help with identifying approaches that you might take in the resolution. It's quite a nice structure to have underlying. So just be mindful, conflict rarely arises from a single cause. And so there's usually going to be interacting in multiple factors, but they are able to be recognised and they can help us, particularly in that exploration phase, to guide the conversation and more effectively support your parties. This is something that can be really, really helpful in the exploration phase. Sometimes novice mediators aren't really sure what to get people to talk about during the exploration. It's just like, I know I need them, have them talking for a bit. What we're really wanting to do is help parties that are stuck in positions to move to recognise their needs and interests and the needs and interests of the others, because then that allows them to generate and consider and evaluate options. But often these escalation patterns, this conflict can't be interrupted unless the causes are identified. And we can't facilitate effective interventions unless we know some of the conflict causes that are at play. So again, a true resolution requires addressing the right problem, not just the symptoms. And that's why if you jump on the first option that comes up and try and lock that in, you may find that you fail your assessment if you're still in the training stage, because you're probably jumping on something that's just thrown out there. It's not a real resolution because it's not actually addressing the underlying problems. So this provides a little bit more guidance. There's a lot more content about this in the course, so I'd encourage you to have a look at that again. But our mindset is really important. So we're approaching this from a point of curiosity. So we're thinking, not judgment. So remember, the exploration isn't just about fact-finding. It's about understanding. There's a difference. Slow down to go fast. So investing time in understanding the causes early, it prevents the blockages later. I'm sure if you participate in a number of role plays, you'll see that things are going along smoothly, too smoothly, and then there's a whole lot of unsaid things that come up while you're trying to document an agreement, that the whole thing can start to fall apart. And we're using multi-level listening. So we're paying attention to what's being said, what's being implied, and we're checking, and what's unspoken, and we're trying to ask people and get people to verbalise those things. And again, we talked already about the importance of creating that safe environment for that to happen. So I'm not going to read through all of this. You can have a look at it, but it basically, some of the focus areas that we're wanting to look at if we're detecting that these are some of the types of issues that are underlying the conflict. And again, we're looking at how these things will fit together, and in some ways that social and community conflict is underlying, particularly around the relationships and the values-led conflicts. Who else is involved in this? So this is usually going to be present in particularly in workplace conflict and situations like that. And of course, interest, expectations, underlying goals, needs, they're always there as well. So again, of the causes and some strategies to address those causes. I'll let you pause the recording and have a look at those. And then if you are on the course, it's probably a good idea to come to one of the live sessions and raise this in the conversation about if you've got any questions about any of these. Now, with the negotiation, the positional negotiation, it is important to understand these negotiation concepts, but I think in some ways they're of a limited use because they rely more on that transactional and belief in rational decision making that isn't always the case. So technically, with the zone of possible agreement, the worst case, the minimum that a seller's willing to accept is on one end. Their best case that they hope they could possibly get is on the other. In the case of the buyer, that's the person that's putting a proposal. They've got a range that they're willing to pay, and the zone of possible agreement is somewhere in there. If you're looking at a compromise, somewhere in between there is probably going to work. And here's another version as a Venn diagram. So that overlap between what someone's willing to pay or give and what someone's willing to accept. The thing is, with a collaborative style negotiation, you can bring in other resources, other options from outside that disrupt this little transactional approach to things, and that can change the dynamic. So understanding the interests rather than just looking at that position as if it's unchangeable can really make a difference to the types of outcomes that can be achieved. Anyway, those are some of the options. I hope you found that useful. Another way to begin a conversation about that is start a post in the network about any of the concepts and see if you can get some conversation going on with some other mediators there. So once again, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you soon.